Remember, this year's theme is Brics in Africa, so a strong African link, collaboration for inclusive growth and shared prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. The five heads of states of the Brics member nations are attending the three-day event, which will end tomorrow. That's Brazil's President Michel Temer. The Russian president has just arrived, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and President Xi from China. Of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa is this year's host. Remember, we've also got a strong component of African nations that are also present here. They are part of the Brics Africa outreach program. The heads of state from Namibia, Gabon, Angola, Senegal, Uganda, Togo, as well as Rwanda will be also in attendance. So indeed, a very, very important summit. The Brics Leaders Summit is convened annually with discussions representing spheres of political and social economic coordination, and the chairmanship of the forum is rotated annually among its members according to the acronym Brics. So lots of excitement, I guess, in terms of trying to get investment, in terms of trying to move these five nations forward. In terms of global economics, we do know about what's happening with the United States and its relationship with the global community. The issue of protectionism, that's key. That is, I guess, one of the broader themes of the Brics Summit. How do they overcome these challenges in terms of certain tariffs that are being imposed on steel and aluminium? Remember, South Africa was invited to join Brics in December 2010, after which the group adopted the acronym Brics. And
Mandla Zondi, they talk about the enmeshed arguments and discussions around whether this is political or whether it's purely legalistic and relating to the prosecution of human rights violations. I would just like your thoughts on the fact that, this has become such a political hot potato for South Africa, and by seeking, legal advice on what to do next might well potentially, provide the pathway for South Africa to say, perhaps we won't be signatories anymore. Do you think that that's a possible and a probable outcome of this?
I don't see that South Africa is going to be able to withdraw from its own Implementation Act, right? In the last few weeks, in fact, it is made clear that in the indications that it had made, that it intended to withdraw from the ICC, and the draft legislation that it had introduced, which would have affected such withdrawal, was to be abandoned. So I don't think that it is plausible or likely that we will see a withdrawal from the International Criminal Court ahead of the August summit in Brics. And I think failing such a withdrawal, our law is clear. It has been made manifestly clear in the wake of the al-Bashir saga that South Africa, in terms of its international law obligations, but in terms of its own constitutional and domestic law obligations, would be obligated to cooperate with the International Criminal Court and look to effect an arrest where somebody like President Putin, who is subject to such indictment, to be on the territory of South Africa.
And in that piece, really well done by Sophie Mokoena there, going back to the court matter and how it developed, even in light of an appeal against the initial decision, means that we have explored the length and the breadth, at least in the al-Bashir moment, for how far South Africa could go in resisting what the ICC demands from us in terms of being signatories, to the Rome Statute. So this decision by our government then to try and find other alternatives, how do you see it potentially playing out?
Look, I think South Africa is in an invidious position. I think it's clear that no state wants to arrest another head of state. The diplomatic repercussions are going to be enormous, even if you're not talking about as powerful a state as Russia. We've heard statements in the last few days from Mr. Medvedev suggesting that those who try and effect an arrest warrant of Mr. Putin would themselves be bombed. The crimes with which Mr. Putin is accused are among the most serious. They are grave atrocity crimes. He heads a state which is engaged in an unlawful war at the moment. So given all those circumstances, I certainly don't think South Africa wants to be in a position where it has to effect an arrest of Mr. Putin. But at the same time, South Africa doesn't want to have to be seen to flout its international and domestic legal obligations. And so I think, South Africa is diplomatically in a very delicate position. It is going to have to explain to its Russian counterparts that it would be unfair to place them in this position. And I think the other thing that our presidency and our diplomats are going to have to communicate is that our government is composed of three arms, and our judiciary is an independent branch of government. And even if our executive were minded to give a guarantee that Mr. Putin will not face arrest were he to come to South Africa, they cannot speak for the courts and for our criminal justice system. The likelihood if he came would be that, people would approach the courts to secure an execution of the arrest warrant.
So draw a parallel then between the 2015 moment, al-Bashir, what you're talking about now, and some of the other scope or things that we learned from what happened in 2015.
Well, I think the other thing, the other context to bear in mind, which is sometimes forgotten because of the al-Bashir debacle and what happened in 2015, is that in fact South Africa navigated those tensions incredibly well prior to al-Bashir's attendance of the AU summit. So al-Bashir had been invited to attend various other diplomatic functions in South Africa, like former President Zuma's inauguration. And there, in fact, South Africa did this delicate negotiation where it communicated to the Sudanese authorities that if Mr. al-Bashir were to attend, they couldn't provide any guarantees that he wouldn't be arrested, given that he was subject of this indictment from the International Criminal Court. And in fact, Mr. al-Bashir then stayed away. And so it was quite surprising in 2015 that they didn't seek to repeat what they had done in previous times where there was a risk of al-Bashir coming into South Africa. Here we now have anticipating a possible attendance at the Brics summit in South Africa by Mr. Putin. He, like Mr. al-Bashir, faces indictment by the International Criminal Court. The circumstances by which that arrest warrant is secured is different, and we can talk about the technicalities thereof, because it's not through a Security Council referral. But in fact, the situations are very analogous, and South Africa's obligations would be no different in respect of its duty to effect an arrest warrant for Mr. Putin were he to attend the Brics summit.
Well, then, just to stay on that theme, Nicole, how do we get out of this cul-de-sac in a way? Given, as you say, it was well handled in the past, the circumstances aren't exactly note for note, exactly the same, slight differences. What scope would South Africa and DIRCO have in this scenario?
I think it's a delicate diplomatic negotiation that they have to undertake. But I think that they, the most powerful, most compelling message that they portray to their Russian counterparts is that South Africa is a constitutional democracy. It is composed of three different branches of government. The judiciary is an independent branch, and even if South Africa were minded, the executive were minded to grant Mr. Putin impunity were he to come to South Africa, it cannot make such guarantees on the part of our courts, and therefore it would be in Mr. Putin and the Russian authorities' interests not to come to South Africa because they would then face the possible arrest. And I think that is the message that the South African government is going to have to convey to their Russian counterparts.
Well, certainly we will be waiting with great anticipation to hear what the ministry in charge, Dr. Naledi Pandor, has to say, what conclusion a government has arrived on this very important diplomatic and political matter. Nicole Fritz, we thank you for your analysis on the subject. She is the Executive Director at the Helen Suzman Foundation.
It cannot be, it has no binding effect on us. The IEC did not go for people who killed the people of Yugoslavia, the Americans. They did not go for the people of America who killed the Iraqi people. When they invaded Iraq, they created an impression that they are weapons of mass destruction. They didn't find none. Yet the IEC has not issued any warrant of arrest against any U.S. president. Gbagbo was arrested here in order for the French government to still take cocoa to determine the price of cocoa in the world market, which they don't produce. It's produced largely in the Ivory Coast. So they humiliated President Gbagbo and his wife through the warrant of arrest exercised by this criminal entity of imperialism, the ICC. It has no credibility whatsoever. Of course, the problem has been that African countries or developing countries, when they saw any other instrument that can limit the abuse of power, they thought they could go for it. But we have seen that this institution is actually a creation of imperialist forces who do not even belong to it. The Americans do not belong to it. By the way, even President Russia has not signed the Rome Statute, so it's not binding. And to think that South Africa will be foolish to try and arrest President Putin, I mean, really, are they mad? I think that thing is immaterial. It cannot be exercised. On the contrary, we will be organizing and to welcome President Putin in South Africa as progressive forces in order to strengthen the new international world order.
Legal expert advocate Michael Osborne joins us now to share his views on the matter. Very good evening to you, Advocate Osborne. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I'd like to juxtapose the current situation that South Africa finds itself in, as you heard from the SACP General Secretary Solima Baila, that this is not the first time. But I want to look at what happened when the ICC issued an arrest warrant for then President of the Sudan, Hassan Omar al-Bashir. South Africa had to contend with two separate treaties, the Rome Statute of the ICC and the AU, as South Africa was playing host country at the time. Is this a completely different situation?
No, it's not completely different. It's similar in many respects. The crucial fact is that in both cases, Mr. Omar al-Bashir and now Mr. Putin, both of them are sitting heads of state. And the argument will be raised whether, whatever you might think of the potential liability of other people, heads of state on diplomatic missions should be granted immunity from protection, and that's the argument that's going to be made.
Now, in the past, borrowing from what happened with the Hassan Omar al-Bashir incident, we actually saw the opposition parties, or particularly the DA, go to the Supreme Court and try and appeal South Africa's decision. And I know then and now that those who were raising the issue of the interpretation of international law, particularly Section 98, subsection 1 in South African courts, and if we could look back at the Supreme Court of Appeal then and the al-Bashir saga, what were the arguments?
Well, the argument was in part what I've already described, the debate about the immunity of heads of state. And the Supreme Court of Appeal found that Mr. al-Bashir would not enjoy head of state immunity given the nature of the crimes with which he had been charged. The crimes that are centrally within the jurisdiction of the ICC are genocide, wars against, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, if credible allegations are made that a head of state is guilty of any of those three, he or she does not enjoy head of state immunity. So it was found it has been found in various international tribunals, and it was also held to be the case by the SCA in the Bashir case.
I guess what I'm trying to do is look particularly at the legal aspect, because I remember then the arguments that were made was that South Africa as a sovereign country has its own national laws, and therefore international treaties would be subservient to national legal statutes. And there were those who were arguing that as a signatory to the Rome Statute, for instance, South Africa is obligated to, for instance, carry out arrest warrants issued for heads of states even who are in the country. But I'd imagine that is quite a complex situation. So what are the methodologies in determining the interpretation? What are the methodological tools on how to interpret and identify what should be international law, what should be domestic law, and what supersedes what?
Yes, you put your finger on the crucial question there, because we recall from the al-Bashir situation that he was visiting for purposes of the AU summit in Johannesburg, and as part of the accreditation for people to come from around Africa, the South African government granted them, or attempted to grant them, some kind of de facto immunity. And the argument was then made before the Supreme Court of Appeal that executive provision of de facto immunity should override the more general obligations under the Rome Statute. And the SCA said, no, that's not the case. That South Africa's international obligations under the Rome Statute, which have been domesticated, to use the term, under the Rome Statute Act of the South African Parliament. If you take those two together, the international obligation and the domestic obligation created by the Implementation Act, they entail that the ad hoc immunity granted for purposes of the AU meeting did not apply. Now, one can imagine a precisely similar debate unfolding with respect to Mr. Putin in August. One assumes that it's possible that the South African government may wish to grant legal protection to the Brics people coming. And that's problematic because of the al-Bashir precedent, which is the only precedent we have, and it happens to come from the Supreme Court of Appeal.
Now, as you heard the SACP General Solly Mapaila describe it as progressive forces are looking forward to and will welcome with open arms President Vladimir Putin's arrival in South Africa. We've had the International Relations Minister saying that South Africa is concerned about the situation of the people in Ukraine, but as we know, that it has resolutely taken a non-aligned stance on this. So, you know, people tend to bring it down to their own political ideologies. So, can the Constitution be leaned on here? If we're told as South Africa that we have the most progressive Constitution in the world, our interpretation of what the Constitution compels us to do, will that unite people then around the legal interpretation of how South Africa should react to the situation?
I don't think I can speculate on how domestic alliances in South Africa will respond to the potential crisis. What I will say is that there's been an effort in the Implementation Act, meaning the act that sets out how an ICC warrant must be processed. That has been set up in such a way so that there is no political intermediation. in the case of the implementation of an ICC warrant. What I mean by that is that the request will come in from
by the International Criminal Court for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Of course, this was over alleged war crimes in Ukraine. We are now joined by Professor Bheki Mgobezulu. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. But help us unpack, South Africa's stance here. As a signatory to the Rome Statute, that established, of course, the ICC, how should South Africa then proceed, especially given that President Putin has indicated that he might attend the Brics summit in this country in August?
Thank you, Unat, for having me. There are quite a number of issues that need to be ventilated on this matter. First of all, we recall that the Rome Statute was signed on the 17th of July in 1998, and then the ICC itself was established on the 1st of July 2002. And the understanding was that all members that signed that particular statute were going to be bound by it. But the assumption was that there was going to be fairness and in executing that particular act. Unfortunately, this has not been the case. You might have seen that there are a number of countries that are not signatories to this Rome Statute and therefore are not members of the ICC. And members of the Security Council, UN Security Council, that is including Russia, including China, including the US and many others. So the reality of the matter, therefore, is that the ICC is being used for political ends or for political expediency, as people would say. So to answer a question then in terms of South Africa was one of the first countries to sign the Rome Statute, and in fact it was the first African country to sign the Rome Statute, and therefore it became a member of the ICC. But then the way things have turned out is that there is no consistency in the manner in which the ICC operates. The case in point being the 2015 al-Bashir matter, which has been discussed by everyone today. So basically, drawing from that particular experience, the American government said that it was not going to arrest al-Bashir on the grounds that he was not in South Africa as a tourist, nor was he in South Africa on a state visit, but had come to attend the AU summit, which was in fact a correct interpretation. But unfortunately, some of our opportunists went to court and then wanted the court to rule against the South African government and then said that they were supposed to arrest al-Bashir. As you know, then of course al-Bashir sneaked out of the country before the court judgment could be in fact read out. Now we do have that court judgment, and there hasn't been any court judgment in between. So looking at things from that logic, then we might say that South Africa is therefore obligated to arrest al-Bashir. But the question is, at what cost? What would be the consequences of arresting Putin if we were to come to South Africa to attend the Brics summit? One, he would not be coming here state visit. And then two, he would not be coming here as a tourist. So the same logic applies as it applied in 2015. So therefore, South Africa is pressed between the rock and the hard place. On the one hand, it has to subscribe to international law, but then on the other hand, it has to follow its own foreign policy agenda. And in this case, there is no easy answer. But from where I'm standing, one option would be for President Putin to deploy someone else to replace him just to save South Africa. But if he were to come here, I would say South Africa has two options. One, to arrest him, and then, of course, to its own peril. And then the other one would be not to arrest him and then face the ICC. So for me, the latter is better. It's better to deal with the ICC, which is less powerful, lacks direction and everything, than to face Russia. Because if we were to arrest Putin, that will be a recipe for disaster, but for the country and then also for the continent.
Especially in terms of, speaking about consequences, especially, following what Russia essentially said, warning that it will be a declaration of war should anyone, act on the ICC's order. And to your point, you've pointed out several scenarios for South Africa. But it would be interesting then, we know that South Africa is due to meet several delegates, from Russia, Russian ministers, to discuss some trade and economic cooperation and so forth. Do you think that would possibly be on the table from South Africa? I know that Cabinet is obviously waiting for legal advice on this matter in terms of the warrant of a warrant of arrest. But is this something that South Africa can table with Russia openly during its discussions?
They have to. Russia and South Africa have cordial relations. Russia has an embassy in Pretoria, and there is also a consulate office in Cape Town. South Africa has an embassy in Russia. So basically, we have cordial relations with Russia, let alone the fact that people will always cite gross human rights violations. That is a case which we can discuss some other time. But the reality of the matter is we have cordial relations with Russia, and we have trade relations with Russia. We have political and diplomatic relations with Russia. And then historically, we also have strong ties with Russia. In fact, by the way, relations between Russia and South Africa did not start under the new political dispensation. Way back in 1942, South Africa and Russia already had relations. But of course, it was a different administration. And the current administration, the post-1994 administration, we have maintained the federation, and therefore it means that whenever things concern Russia, we have to tread carefully, which is exactly the reason why we didn't take a position to criticize Russia at the UN Security Council on 2 occasions. And people said that South Africa did not take a position. I think they are missing the point. South Africa took a position, and the position was to be neither on the west nor on the east, but to say we are following our foreign policy, which puts forward diplomatic relations and not hard power in the form of arms, but of course to encourage negotiations and discussions. So that in itself is a position, by the way. It doesn't mean that we'll only take a position if we decide to kill or not to kill. We just say, okay, here's the situation, let us find the best way to address it. And South Africa says that is through diplomacy. So I think that is the context within which we have to understand this particular.
Prof, I want to loop back very quickly to what you said in terms of an inconsistency of, the ICC. In fact, in South Africa, some political parties have weighed in on this, including the SACP early on with my colleague saying that the ICC's warrant is not binding on South Africa. In fact, EFF leader Julius Malema argued that the ICC had failed to act against Western leaders, including former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as an example, and former US Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And in fact, the SACP and EFF saying that, they are putting their position out there to say that Russia is in fact welcome in South Africa. Just weigh in on some of those comments that we are hearing coming out from political parties.
My sister, let's look at this issue in 2 ways. From a legal point of view, to abide by the ICC statute. So therefore, it means they have to arrest Putin. But from a political point of view, that would not be something that I would advise South Africa to do. In other words, a signatory to the Rome Statute, but it doesn't mean that we have to implement that statute without looking at the reality. Because the reality is that if we were to arrest Putin, definitely we might as well communicate with the men upstairs and say we are coming, we're on our way. Because that is exactly what is going to happen. Now, when it comes to inconsistencies, remember that I've said earlier on, the P5 countries, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, are not members of the ICC. But then the way it has been structured is that even if we are not a member of the ICC, the UN can in fact recommend that a warrant of arrest be issued against you. Ironically, the people who are making that recommendation are themselves not members of the ICC. So basically, that is something that does not make sense. In fact, it's senseless, to be blunt. It's senseless that We are not a member of the ICC, but we are using political ends. Now, one other issue that I can bring in here, which is a political issue, is that after the UN Security Council and after the UN General Assembly had debated this matter, South Africa did not side with the West. Is this not a way of punishing South Africa for not having sided with the West? That is a question that we need to contemplate on. Because it means that they waited for an opportunity to punish South Africa for not siding with the West. And this is a great opportunity to do that, because currently South Africa is the chair of Brics, and of course then President Cyril Ramaphosa has an obligation to send out the invitation letters, including the one going to Vladimir Putin in Russia to come and attend the summit. Now, after the letter has been issued, then we have this ICC issuing against Putin. Why did they wait until it was on the eve of a meeting? Because the meeting is happening in August this year. So it means that plans are already underway. Why didn't they do this? The war against the Ukraine started on the 24th of February last year. So have no atrocities been committed between that time and June last year or even December last year? If the answer is in the affirmative, why was no action taken until now that South Africa is about to host the BRICS summit? Then you issue this particular warrant of arrest. So I would say from a legal point of view, South Africa is bound, but then from a political point of view, that is definitely a no for me. South Africa must not arrest Vladimir Putin, even if we were to come here, because that will have disastrous consequences.
There were suggestions way back, with the al-Bashir incident in 2016. In fact, former President Jacob Zuma suggesting that perhaps South Africa should use the opportunity to withdraw and, from the ICC back in 2016 already. Would this particular incident see South Africa finally pulling out of the ICC, because it seems like it continues to draw criticism from the West, irrespective of what it does in this relation, especially if you draw back, to the 2015 matter, and also, as you've just rightfully said, again, South Africa receiving criticism for its neutral stance in the Russia-Ukraine war.
A short answer on that will be yes, of course. There will definitely be consequences. Let's have